Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, August 4th, 2020. Our dear tweeter is spinning himself into contradiction left and right. The guy who refused to wear a mask now says it's a patriotic thing to do. And the guy who is bitterly opposed to mail-in voting says that it's safe and secure in Florida. First up, I want to tip my hat to Carl Lauer. He is one of the volunteer technicians on my local TV show here. And he forwarded me an email addressed to Carlton. Maybe that's his full name. I've never checked his ID. But for fun, he signed up for emails from the Trump campaign. And Carlton received this yesterday. From the Donald. I know how difficult the past few months have been. Your unwavering support during this time has not gone unnoticed. I am writing to you now not to ask for a contribution, but to ask for your help. We are all in this together. Well, that's a laugh line to start with. And while I know there has been some confusion surrounding the usage of face masks, I think it's something we should all try to do when we're not able to be socially distanced from others. Well, the confusion, Don, has come from you. All right, let's continue. I don't love wearing them either. Duh. Masks may be good. They may be just okay, or they may be great. No option for them being bad. They can possibly help us get back to our American way of life that so many of us rightfully cherished before we were so terribly impacted by, drumroll please, the China virus. My feeling is we have nothing to lose and possibly everything to gain, including the next chapter to our country, and to keep things open, whether it be schools or businesses. I recently tweeted that many view wearing a mask as a patriotic act, and there is no one more patriotic than me and you. Why not give it a shot? Notice how he writes the letter to you, but he's got to mention himself first. And then in case there's any confusion, he closes with thank you, a picture of himself, and under it reads Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. Well, I'm glad we clarified all that. Then there is his about face on mail-in voting, at least for people in Florida. In a tweet today, he wrote, whether you call it vote by mail or absentee voting, in Florida the election system is capital S safe and capital S secure, capital T tried and capital T true. Florida's voting system has been cleaned up. Parentheses, we defeated Democrats' attempts at change. So in Florida, I encourage all to request a ballot and vote by mail. Now, this has to be really confusing to his loyal followers, because he has over 70 times tweeted or stated that voting by mail is going to cost Republicans, including himself, the election. And it's risky, it's rigged, it's fraudulent. And he's trying to slow down the post office to do their, to cause that ripple effect that could make ballots late arriving at voters' homes or late arriving at the voting registrar or whoever handles that in your particular area. So I do understand if you feel a sense of whiplash, because this is the same Donald Trump who yesterday threatened to sue the state of Nevada because over the weekend they passed a mail-in voting law over the objections of a Republican Secretary of State. But Trump called it an illegal late-night coup. And while the vote did take place on Sunday, which is a little surprising, most legislatures don't convene on weekends, the vote was taken, I believe, at 10:30 a.m. So it's hard to call it either illegal, late night, or a coup. His tweet continued, Nevada's clubhouse governor, I don't know what that means, made it impossible for Republicans to win the state. Post office could never handle the traffic of mail-in votes without preparation. See you in court. So, mail-in voting is safe and secure, tried and true in Florida, but it's risky and draws a lawsuit in Nevada. What could possibly be the strategy behind this? Well, don't think too hard about that because chances are there is no answer to my question. And today is the delayed primary election in a number of states, including Michigan, where some voters were at the polls because the absentee ballots they requested were not received. Now, many people, I think, are going to jump to the conclusion that this is related to the new rules with no overtime that are slowing down delivery of the U.S. mail. But frankly, I find that hard to believe. And I don't know if these are simple errors, innocent errors, if this has been bungled by election officials in some counties, if this is focused on certain types of voters, say Democrats. So I'd need to know a lot more before I would start blaming the post office. Michigan is a state where it has to be received by Election Day, the mail-in ballot. So many people are dropping them off in special drop boxes or at their local election offices. And this is another thing, I mentioned this yesterday, that I am not as concerned as others are about the interference at the Postal Service as it relates to mail-in voting. Because there are many ways to get an absentee ballot to the tabulation centers. You can even take them to your local polling place, or they call them voting centers now. And I believe every community should have a secure drop box that looks like a mailbox where people can take their ballots and be assured that they will be collected on or before Election Day by the local officials. So I don't think that we should, just accept that the Postal Service is being messed with and in any way allow it to interfere with our desire to vote. Now, in Michigan, they mailed out 2,066,000 absentee ballots. And they're saying that 1.48 million have been returned as of 10:30 this morning. So that is a significant gap. Almost 500,000 ballots not yet received. Now, people have until the closing of the polls to deliver those ballots, but it is concerning that so many are outstanding here on Election Day. So there are a number of races across the country. In Detroit, Rashida Tlaib, member of the Squad, is facing a pretty strong opponent. She's the president of the Detroit City Council, who had run against Tlaib last time and lost. And Chris Kobach, the interstate cross-check voter suppression specialist, is running for the Senate in Kansas over the objections of a lot of mainstream, well, what's a mainstream Republican? The people who are running things these days. Mike Pompeo, just like Kobach, is a Kansan who is very tight with the Koch Industries people. But Pompeo has been advising the Republican leadership not to back Kobach. They don't think he can win in November, and they're afraid of losing a seat that has been Republican since deep into the last century. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, election integrity experts told Congress today that without an immediate substantial infusion of federal funds to help administer November's general election, many voters, particularly black and other minority voters, could be disenfranchised. Here's a quote from Sylvia Albert, Director of Voting and Elections at Common Cause. With less than 3 months until the November election, Congress must act now so states have enough time to make the necessary changes and plans, recruit and train workers, buy equipment, and do outreach to the public about new voting processes. She said long-standing disparities, including long lines, the ballot rejection rates, particularly of black and brown communities, are now exacerbated by the pandemic. The chasm of those with access is growing larger. Voters of color are on the losing end. Now, this is where you have to scratch your head because these are the kinds of things that would make Trump salivate. A system that disadvantages black and Democratic voters, people of color? You'd think he'd be all over it. And he is all over the place. It's okay in Florida. Not so okay in the silver state of Nevada. And speaking of Trump and the vote, there's an interesting commentary piece by New York Times columnist Jamel Bouie at the paper today. He says, we've accepted as a matter of course that Trump could be constitutionally reelected through the Electoral College, but not democratically selected by the voting public. In other words, he could lose the popular vote like he did last time and still prevail in the Electoral College. And if you haven't heard my most recent interview about the Electoral College with the attorney who argued one of the cases recently before the Supreme Court, that's Jason Harrow, and activist Adam Eichen, I highly recommend it to you. We go through a lot of the central issues and the details of the Electoral College and how to fix it. So back to Bouie here. Trump and his allies embrace the plainly anti-democratic feature of our political system to liberate themselves from majoritarian politics and coalition building. It's not just that they can win with a mere plurality, but that they intend to, with no interest in persuading the majority of American voters, no concern for the consequences of that choice. And Trump took this as a license for an intentionally divisive style of politics, stoking anger and racial prejudice whenever it seemed politically advantageous. He bases key governing decisions on whether he won a state or group of states, or there's a state he lost that he wants to punish. Bouie continues, all of this is obviously carried over into the president's re-election campaign. He's made no attempt to win a majority of voters, no effort to bring a skeptical public to his side. Instead, he has directed his energy toward suppressing opposition in hopes of winning by technical knockout for a second time. And he is attacking the post office. And Bouie references Nevada. They approved a plan to send mail-in ballots to all active voters in November. Trump denounced the plan as an illegal late-night coup that will make it impossible for Republicans to win the state. The Republican Party is all in on the effort to keep the anti-Trump public from casting anti-Trump votes. The Republican National Committee has established a program to protect the vote by monitoring polling places, challenging voters deemed suspicious, blocking efforts to expand vote by mail, or relax voting restrictions. In Pennsylvania, for example, it wants to keep voters from using officially designated drop boxes like the ones I described, forcing them to go through the mail system. Trump is also engaged in a kind of petty micromanaging of a couple of issues. First up, TikTok. Now, I've seen TikTok videos, and some of them are cute and clever, but I, for one, do not see it as any kind of risk to national security. And it seems to be just another element in the blame China playbook. But even as TikTok is, at its own resistance, submitting to selling its U.S. operations to Microsoft, Trump, who has backed down from a threat to shut down TikTok based on authority that is not known to most of us, well, he has replaced that with a threat to Microsoft, saying you've got some period of time, I think he said until mid-September, to put a deal together. And then he moved into extortion mode, threatening that Microsoft better chip in to the U.S. Treasury some unknown amount as a commission to Trump for facilitating this sale. So the government of China, through its, what is this called? Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., they have ordered the parent company of TikTok, ByteDance, to fully divest TikTok's U.S. operations. So they don't really have a choice. And the guy who founded it, Zhang Yiming, once had a job at Microsoft, but he found it boring and he quit. He said, I basically read half the day and worked half the day. So at any rate, this is a case where I think that Trump just created this hysteria over TikTok. And here comes Microsoft. They're loaded with cash, and they don't own any social media. They're kind of left out of developments of the last 10 years. Oh, they're still soaking us for all their software licensing fees. But they seem eager to try to update themselves by buying this hot new platform. So we'll see how that one plays out. Also, the petty micromanager inserted himself into the affairs of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, they operate the electrical system with hydro and I think some nuclear plants based in Tennessee. And Trump has decided that they have been unfairly replacing American workers with low-cost foreign labor. Now, the TVA leaders deny this, saying that like any other government agency, they do hire some contractors under the H-1B visa program. Trump is gunning for the chief executive of TVA, Jeff Lyash. He makes $900,000 a year in a package that has a total tag of about $8 million. Well, Trump says he makes $8 million a year. And he wants to reduce that just arbitrarily to $500,000 per year. Now, if you look around at what executives in, the commercial utility operations get paid, $920,000 is below average. So the TVA issued a statement. All TVA employees are U.S.-based citizens. All jobs related to TVA's Information Technology Department must be performed in the U.S. by individuals who may legally work in this country. So Trump has fired the chair of the TVA, James Skip Thompson, a Trump appointee whose term was scheduled to end next year. And another director's term expired, and he is serving until someone else is appointed to replace him. So, Trump is obviously trying to score points, making an immigration issue at the Tennessee Valley Authority. But it shows that he is more concerned about these petty, minor details of the U.S. government than the big picture. And, of course, it allows him to ignore his continued failures related to managing the pandemic here. They're also taking another whack at the United States 2020 census. Back in April, they said, hey, because of COVID, we're going to need more time. We're going to extend our deadline to collect all the data and then to tabulate it into the formal census. And yesterday, abruptly, the agency reverted to the original schedule. They will shorten the deadline to respond to the census and end counting on the 30th of September. And then they are going to report their results. But many people feel that since only 63% of U.S. households have responded so far, that it is the hard-to-get participants who require outreach and maybe a knock on the door, people who are concerned that responding to the census might involve contact with law enforcement. But, for example, in Detroit, less than half of households have responded to date. And an undercount in Detroit would, reduce potentially the amount of federal dollars flowing to the state. It could reduce the number of congressional seats they are assigned. And, of course, Trump ordered the Bureau of the Census to just exclude undocumented immigrants, which, of course, can't be done and is unconstitutional. But, hey, he gets to call it any way he wants. And so much of the bullshit that he utters is forgotten the next day. Like postponing the election, wearing a mask, mail-in voting in Florida. Senator Elizabeth Warren and 3 other lawmakers, Ron Wyden of Oregon, Congressman Mark DeSaulnier of California, and the chair of the Oversight and Reform Committee in the House, Carolyn Maloney, they are demanding more information from a company called Mobile Walla, which collects your data from your cell phone usage. It grabs your location, and they use it all to predict the race, age, gender, and home location of more than 17,000 Black Lives Matter protesters. Mobile Walla analyzed location information that it collected from thousands of protesters' cell phones in Minneapolis, New York, L.A., and Atlanta at the end of May. They used this data to predict if protesters were male or female, their age category, their race. By using long-term location data, Mobile Walla also attempted to predict whether protesters were from the city or out of town. So this is legal. There are no federal regulations that control how data collectors like Mobile Walla can buy, repackage, and sell your information, even to the U.S. government. There's probably a restriction on the government collecting that data, but not their purchase of it from third parties. We have 2 ugly scenes to report to you today. Black Americans being harassed at gunpoint by police officers. First to Aurora, Colorado. Sunday morning, a family called the Gilliams. All the females piled into an SUV. They were going to go get their nails done. 4 children ended up ordered by cops at gunpoint to lie face down in a parking lot. 2 of them were handcuffed. The girls, ranging in age from 6 to 17 years old, broke down into tears and screams as a group of white police officers hovered over them. "I want my mother," one of them could be heard wailing on a video. "Can't I have my sister next to me?" Well, the cops blamed a misunderstanding. They say the license plate number on a stolen motorcycle matched the family's SUV, and that SUV had been reported missing to the same police department earlier this year. Now, I find both of those excuses, they set off my bullshit detector. I don't know any state where a motorcycle license plate has enough characters in it to be confused with a full plate on a vehicle, a 4-wheeled vehicle. And the idea that they had the license plate listed because they had been searching for it when it was stolen or missing earlier this year, I don't get that. Maybe there was a data entry problem where the resolution of that report was not added. So Brittany Gilliam, who had been driving the younger family members to the salon, said, "That's police brutality. There is no excuse why you didn't handle it a different type of way. You could have even told them, step off to the side. Let me ask your mom or your auntie a few questions so we can get this cleared up." So you may have seen the video. It's making the rounds on Facebook and in other social media. And The interim chief of the Aurora Police Department, Vanessa Wilson, spoke to the media and kind of blamed their training and procedures. She said that cops must be allowed to deviate from the written procedure, depending on the different scenarios they face in the field. Then on Monday night, as the video was spreading on social media, the city council voted to make Vanessa Wilson the permanent police chief. I mean, wouldn't they even pause and say, hey, Vanessa, you got to get a grip on your officers if you're going to be our chief. So now to Washington, D.C., not far from the White House, where the Secret Service conducts patrols. Last Thursday, in the brutal heat of Washington, the humidity there can be just killer, 2 young women who are moms and friends, India Johnson and Yasmin Winston, they're in their mid-20s. They decided to take their babies to splash in the fountains at the World War II Memorial. They parked their car on Constitution Avenue. And as they were moving around and getting ready to pull the kids out of the back seat, a Secret Service cruiser crashed into their car head-on. It's believed the officer was driving on the opposite side of the street, and he crossed the double yellow line and ended up hitting this car. Secret Service officers pointing a rifle jumped out of their vehicle, yelling, "Get out, put your hands in the air." More officers surrounded with guns pulled. Over the next hour, the 2 women were handcuffed without reason, separated from their crying babies, handled by police who at first did not wear masks. The women are now demanding that Secret Service investigate the encounter and release details of the incident that made them fear for their lives and the safety of their children. Their attorney, Timothy Maloney: "This incident took place near our national monuments across from the White House. It occurred after 8 weeks of unprecedented national demonstrations about excessive police conduct, some of which took place right there on Constitution Avenue. Has the Secret Service learned nothing this summer?" Initially, the women told us, an officer told them that the vehicle had been reported stolen, and the suspects were 2 black men. But the women, both African Americans, said no men were with them, provided proof that Johnson owned the vehicle. She told the Secret Service she had never reported the car stolen. And eventually the women were released without an apology or any answers to their question. And they tried to get business cards or other documents from the Secret Service officers who said, "Oh, we don't have anything like that." So one of the women pulled out a pen and paper and did jot down the information on at least one of these Secret Service officers. And after the incident was over, a bystander told them that the officers had searched Johnson's car without her permission or a warrant. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Great people like Arlene Baker, DGL, you know who you are, Jim McHugh, and Julie Dupree. They each chip in $5 or $10 a month to keep the lights on here and pay the bills. And I'd appreciate it if you'd like to join in. Just visit peterbcollins.com/sign up. Over at the Gray Zone, a big scoop for Ben Norton today. He got a hold of a document from USAID. That is the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is nominally a group that promotes democracy and often, hands out humanitarian aid. But it's well known as a front for the CIA. They used to keep that a little more discreet. But a document has surfaced that details the creation of a new task order called RAIN, Responsive Assistance in Nicaragua, and its plan for Nicaragua's transition to democracy. This is the blueprint for a coup of the government of Daniel Ortega. In the pages of the memo, they use hardline neoconservative rhetoric, referring to the elected government as the Ortega regime. Oh, and in Washington and in the media, when the word regime is used, it's meant to discredit. It is a code word for a government that we detest, and often a government that we feel justified in acting to overthrow. So this memo states openly that one of its top mission goals is for Nicaragua to transition to a rules-based market economy based on the protection of private property rights. It includes talking about a future U.S.-installed regime in Nicaragua to rebuild institutions, reestablish the military and police, dismantle parallel institutions that support the Sandinista front, and to persecute leaders of that movement through transitional justice measures. Wow. I don't know if that includes execution. USAID declared its intention to assist in what could be an orderly transition or a sudden transition without elections, which is clear code for a coup. So this is a very damaging document. You can imagine there's similar papers related to Venezuela. And in 2018, the Trump administration supported a violent coup attempt in Nicaragua in which far-right gangs took over neighborhoods, paralyzed the country with bloody barricades. The U.S.-backed insurgents unleashed a reign of terror, killing and injuring hundreds of Sandinista activists and state security forces. October surprise, anyone? Good work, Ben Norton. You deserve a lot of credit for breaking that story. News has broken from Beirut, Lebanon. A very large explosion. I saw one report saying casualties were at least at the level of 25, and I saw another showing more than 50 have died. Now, there is some confusion because at least one of the what are described as a number of blasts may have come from a fire at a fireworks warehouse. But the origins of this and any responsibility are not clear at this point. In a rare statement from Israel, they acknowledged airstrikes from fighter jets and attack helicopters on military targets in southern Syria on Monday night. Israel says it was retaliating for irregular activity in the Golan Heights. They claim they saw some people trying to attach explosives to an Israeli barrier. Meanwhile, the dramatic attack on a major prison in Jalalabad, Afghanistan, that started on Sunday was finally ended Monday evening. The body count there, at least 29 dead. And curiously, the Islamic State has asserted responsibility for the assault. But this account that I'm looking at from the Washington Post suggests that when the Taliban conducts operations that they want to distance themselves from, they blame the Islamic State. At any rate, the incident started on Sunday with a car bomb that was driven into the prison's main gate, and then 20 to 30 armed fighters, some who were in a high-rise building across the street from the prison, started shooting, and then another group of the militants blew up the complex's rear wall, and some 330 prisoners remain at large at this time. So Trump gave a pretty awkward interview to Axios, which is now airing on HBO. And I don't know too much about Axios as a media organization, but their national political correspondent, Jonathan Swan, conducted the interview, and Trump said some pretty stupid things. One is he keeps confusing the flu pandemic from the 1900s, saying it was in 1917, when it actually happened in 1918 and 1919. And he tripped over himself with this. He said the pandemic is unique. This has never happened before. 1917, but it was totally different. It was a flu in that case. If you watch the fake news on television, they don't even talk about it. But there are 188 other countries right now that are suffering, some proportionately far greater than we are. When asked about the death toll, now at 155,000, Trump appeared irritated and said, "It is what it is." Oh, he just oozes compassion, doesn't he? Later, he said that, once again, the problem is that we're just testing too much. And he told Mr. Swan, "Oh, just read the manuals, read the books." And he appears without evidence to assert that children are receiving positive COVID-19 test results for having a runny nose. You test, some kid has even just a little runny nose, it's a case. And then you report many cases. Then he tries to shift the blame to state governors. We have done a great job. We've got governors everything they needed. They didn't do their job. Many of them didn't. Some of them did. And, I mean, part of this is just Trump. He speaks in this convoluted manner, interrupting himself, incomplete thoughts, language that doesn't make any sense. Then he goes around and says that Joe Biden is incoherent. Well, Joe has his challenges, no doubt about it. But I do find him more coherent than Trump. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. Globally, the confirmed caseload at 18.3 million now, total deaths edging up to 700,000. Across the United States, total confirmed cases at 4.7 million, total deaths 156,000. And all those tests, 57 million, but Trump has been saying it's 60 million for at least a week. Over half of Americans surveyed in a new NPR poll support a mandatory nationwide order to shelter at home for 2 weeks to slow the spread of the coronavirus. About 2/3 said they believe the U.S. is handling the pandemic worse than other countries. 62% support a single national strategy for when businesses can reopen, while 60% support a similar strategy for schools. That's really a no-brainer. And the only real disagreement comes from the White House. Here in California, we are cautiously optimistic, as in the past week, the numbers of new cases, the number of hospitalizations, the number of people in ICUs have all declined, and so has the percentage of people testing positive. And to me, that's the most important metric. We had ticked up to 7.5% last week, and it has now dropped to an average of 7% over the past 14 days. Also, daily new cases are down 21% over the last 2 weeks to 7,800. Hospitalizations have fallen 10%, with about 6,400 currently in the hospital and about 2,000 who are in intensive care. So it's a development. We see on some of the graphs that when it goes down, it can go back up. So we will remain vigilant. Random coronavirus tests at the White House will now become mandatory for staff in the executive office of the president. The heightened level of enforcement with the random testing policy comes as part of our ongoing efforts to protect the health and safety of the entire White House, an official said. Multiple people who work in the White House have tested positive, including at least one who was in close proximity to the president. The random testing policy has already been in place on a voluntary basis for several months, but Politico says that White House staff had received an email yesterday morning informing them that random testing was starting that day. Failure to report for testing will be considered a refusal to test. Yeah, and then what? Well, I don't know. The White House testing czar, Admiral Brett Giroir, has said that they have plans to provide every nursing home in the country with a fast COVID-19 testing machine. But the fine print shows that if and when you get such a machine, they're only going to give you enough material to test the staff and the residents once or twice. And that's like, delivering a huge gumball machine with a really small bag of gumballs. Jawar acknowledged that the administration's effort to provide at least one fast testing machine to each of the nation's 15,000 nursing homes is a work in progress. It's not wrapped up with a bow on it yet. We're doing this as aggressively as possible. I mean, did they just think about it? The first outbreak in the suburbs of Seattle was at a nursing home. We've known in California that nursing homes are vulnerable since March. So the program is on track to deliver 2,400 to 15,000 locations, and that is with a deadline of mid-August. However, materials from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services say that getting a machine to every nursing home could take 14 weeks. Oh, geez. Experts say the coronavirus probably gets into nursing homes via staffers, that the machines they're sending perform antigen tests which check for fragments of the virus protein in samples collected from an individual's nose. The test takes about 20 minutes, but it is not the most reliable test. It does produce false negatives, maybe even false positives, I don't know. The gold standard is the PCR test, which identifies the genetic material of the virus. So in the absence of any national strategy or coordination for testing, 3 Republican and 3 Democratic governors, led by Maryland's Governor Larry Hogan, a Republican, have put together their own testing pact. They are going to request 500,000 tests for a total of 3 million over the 6 states, which are Virginia, Louisiana, Michigan, Ohio, Massachusetts, and Maryland. Virginia Governor Ralph Northam, who is a medical doctor, said that the states involved are leading America's national response to COVID-19. We are bringing together this bipartisan multi-state coalition to combine our purchasing power, get rapid testing supplies to our communities as quickly as possible. Also, I just wanted to note that when there is discussion about when to reopen schools, I rarely see references to what we have covered here, which is the sorry experience in Israel. When their schools reopened in May, within days, infections were reported first at a Jerusalem high school. Then the virus rippled out to the students' homes, to other schools and neighborhoods, infecting hundreds of students, teachers, and relatives. This forced hundreds of schools to close across the country. Tens of thousands of students and teachers were quarantined. And I think this is the important standard, or at least the real-world experience, that should inform the efforts to reopen schools here in the U.S. You probably struggle with the pronunciation of this guy's name if you have any concept of who he is at all. He is the man that Trump has put in charge of Operation Warp Speed, which is the program to try to develop a vaccine for COVID-19. And the man who leads it, Moncef, M-O-N-C-E-F, Slaoui, S-L-A-O-U-I, is a walking conflict of interest. He's a former executive with GlaxoSmithKline. He's on the board of other pharma companies. But in a sympathetic interview conducted by the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs at Health and Human Services, the podcast was released on Friday, Mr. Slaoui blames the media for creating the distraction. I'm amazed I'm being attacked on a personal basis in a way that frankly distracts my energy and the energy of all the teams we're working together with to deliver, and therefore decreases our chances or the speed with which we try to help humanity and the country resolve and address this issue. And he's saying 2 things. One is, since he's working for $1, which relieves him of having to disclose all of his financial interests, that create a conflict of interest. He is saying that it's the media's fault for reporting the truth. And he said the reports have been insulting to the deepest of his personal fibers. Oh, boy. What a world we live in. I want to recommend a new report by Kevin Gosztola at Shadowproof. And let me pause to honor Kevin and Brian Sonnenstein, the co-founders of Shadowproof, as they observe their 5th anniversary. It's a great outlet. And Kevin, of course, writes under a column that's called The Dissenter. And in his latest dispatch, he cites a report from the Project on Government Oversight that federal employees largely view the so-called dissent channels as a waste of time, and they fear that they'll face retaliation if they step up and report wrongdoing, fraud, waste, those sorts of things. So this new report found that existing channels at the State Department and other agencies are underutilized and that the systems don't provide sufficient incentives or protections for employees. At a time when the White House is explicitly hostile toward career government experts, it's clear that federal workers need more effective, independent channels for constructively criticizing policy decisions and need better protections for expressing policy dissent. Pogo outlined the use of dissent channels at the State Department, the USAID, those fine folks working in Nicaragua or on Nicaragua, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Energy Department, the FDA, and a few other agencies. There is an entirely separate process for potential whistleblowers, and the lack of protection for those who use dissent channels may limit the ability of someone with political differences to obtain whistleblower protections when they're not really blowing the whistle on corruption. On the other hand, without statutory protections that cover dissent, it is probably very easy for senior officials to root out individuals who challenge their decision-making. And related to the Energy Department, are you listening, Joe? Pogo states, if an employee believes that the Energy Department's elimination of a program for detecting nuclear explosions creates a risk to public safety, it isn't clear whether disputing the elimination would be a protected disclosure based on a reasonable belief of danger, or whether it would simply be a debatable policy disagreement. So, interesting observations there from Mr. Gosztola. Last week, it was Thursday, U.S. Border Patrol, fresh from their big victory in Portland. Well, it's probably different people. But they rousted a humanitarian camp operated by the migrant aid group No More Deaths near the border in Arivaca, Arizona, about 11 miles north of the Mexican border. The raid resulted in the arrest of one person, setting up of ongoing surveillance and enforcement operations at the site. And this is the same group where one of the members was prosecuted for leaving water bottles for migrants who just might travel through the area and be thirsty. Scott Warren is the guy you may recall. But this was a pretty ugly incident with, quite a bit of overkill. The raid began with a Border Patrol agent on horseback riding in at 9 o'clock in the morning without a warrant. The agent proceeded to detain a migrant who was then taken into custody. And while this was going on, other agents in all-terrain vehicles and cop cars circled the camp, continued their enforcement operations through Friday. They also set up a checkpoint on one of the roads leading to the camp while flying surveillance drones above the campsite. Yes, humanitarian responses are verboten. Just want to briefly remark on a Sunday opinion piece in the New York Times under the byline of Margaret O'Mara, who's a history professor at the University of Washington. And apparently she watched different hearings last week than the ones that I saw, when Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and Tim Cook of Apple and Sundar Pichai of Google remotely zoomed in to a congressional hearing. and they were pilloried by posturing elected officials. But Ms. O'Mara suggests that these hearings are a sign that tech regulation could come soon. And I believe that's wishful thinking. I see no evidence of any appetite for regulation, and members of neither party are stepping up to even outline ways that they would regulate tech, most importantly, to protect our private data. Now, in the same New York Times, the Sunday edition, a front pager, breaking out the lobbyists who are populating the upper echelon of the Biden for President campaign, led by Steve Ricchetti. Well, Steve is a pretty busy guy who has been involved with a lot of corporate representation and lobbying over the years. Then, of course, he spent years as a registered lobbyist, and he's being paid by the Biden campaign and by AT&T, one of his long-standing clients. Then there is Anita Dunn, Biden's chief campaign strategist. She's still on the AT&T payroll, and I guess that means that she's no longer being paid to lobby for TransCanada to promote the Keystone XL and the Dakota Access pipelines. There are others who are named, but going back to the early days of the Obama administration, Biden pressed against the restrictions on lobbyists, and we expect the same should he prevail in November. And finally today, I want to say happy trails and farewell to Ralph Barbieri. Ralph was a longtime sports talk show host here in San Francisco, and he and I worked together at KNBR. He was there for 28 years. I only lasted 3. But Ralph was a complicated guy. He had one of the absolutely worst voices for radio, and the infamous San Francisco columnist Herb Caen tagged him as Razor Voice because his voice was so damn raspy. But behind that, Ralph was a guy who could be very angry. He was passionate about his San Francisco Giants, and when they were winning, he was a homer, and when they were losing, he was a sharp critic. And he and I shared a large office. Our desks were adjacent. And Ralph was a guy who was deeper than your average jock talk sports guy. He had a degree in political science and an MBA as well. And he and I often talked about politics because I don't talk sports. I don't know diddly about sports. And he often confessed to me that he'd like to fill in for me when I went on vacation because he wanted to talk about more than sports. He had a lot of views, and he was fairly left, as I recall, on politics and those related issues. But management had him in a straitjacket. He was a sports guy, and even on his sports show, he couldn't talk about other things in the real world. Ralph battled Parkinson's for 15 years. He was fired by Cumulus Media after he disclosed his Parkinson's to management. And we don't know the terms, but he won what was described as a very lucrative settlement for his improper termination. Ralph Barbieri died yesterday at the age of 74. Happy trails, Ralph Aru.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.